happens. Wait and see what happens because I have to go back inside to load the next day's playlist. Nothing. At like 3:02 I decide, scared as fuck, to go back inside. As I'm walking back towards the door, I hit the deck after I heard an ear-shattering clap. Wobbly wobbly wobbly. And then the sound of something fucking electrical like shorting out. The huge boom came from our main network receiver dish. The thing is like 30 feet in diameter and up on a huge robotic tripod. The thing somehow slipped out of lock and literally fell with all its weight, collapsing to the bottom position, facing the ground. Immediately. Tells me he'll be there immediately. He lives right up the street so he'll be there in like 2 minutes. Follow sound of the shorting out sound. Find that between the building to the sheetrock wall, a fucking transmission line broke and is completely unrelated to the dish falling. That fucking sticker about overhead wires was not lying. Boss shows up. Tell him I was outside smoking when the thing fell. He proclaims, I have never seen anything like this before. We go in together to the sound of alarms related to the dish. I tell him about the transmission line, tell him the next day's guy will have to do the playlist because fuck you I'm leaving. He literally does not give a fuck and has bigger fish to fry. I get in my truck and hit the road. I call my buddy William who was always fucking up late as shit to tell him about what happened. As I am going over the events with him, out of the earpiece of the phone, and I shit you not, it goes and will fucking heard it too. This is exactly how it fucking happened. Sorry if some of you fuckers don't like it because it isn't nice and tidy and perfect like your made up skinwalker pastas, but this is how fucking shit went down. I still can't explain it to this day, and I never tell anyone because people fucking laugh. I come to tell X and some of you will still bitch about it. Well, file this fucking story away under true pasta because I did not just type all of this shit up to just be dismissed. To start, I apologize in advance for the length of this story and want to firmly make sure that I do not care if it is believed or not. If you cannot believe it, I can only say I understand and wouldn't myself if I hadn't experienced it. This was 3 years ago. I was doing postgraduate study which concerned Aboriginal communities. I was allowed a placement in the Yangu town of Ramininning in Arnhem Land, which is a tiny strip of halfway urbanized land that borders the huge fuck-off bog which is rather kindly called a Rapura swamp. The swamp is probably one of the most wild places in Australia. Imagine a country-sized swathe of perpetually decaying forest flooded in a stagnant foul-smelling water plain. And with crocs, a real danger. My place was basically a shack and it was right at the edge of the swamp. It was technically not within the town limits and actually sat a good couple of miles away along a dirt road. It was an abandoned country house and I had it all to myself. The back had a veranda that looked out over the Great Black Swamp, some very impressive views come dusk, and on either side it was enclosed in a dusty circle of eucalyptus. I knew literally no one out there and won't lie when say it was pretty creepy those first weeks trying to acclimate to being more truly alone than I had ever been before, in this old rusty tin shed of a house, halfway out of town in a clearing at the edge of the swamp. But adaptiveness is a virtue and I soon found myself spending my spare time fixing up the place and even sowing seed out the front and chopping some littler trees down. I remember my pride as I felled a small tree for the first time, after hours of panting. When I went into town and sold off the wood, I told the folk there it had taken a lot less time than it really did. They were all well accustomed to hard labor and it was quite a culture shock when I took dinner at homes that didn't have a television, let alone a computer. The people did not all live in exactly what would be termed poverty, as some places were wealthier than others in the typical sense, and there was a real effort at maintaining a distance from some norms of outer society anyway. For example, there was, and remains, a ban on booze that was taken fairly seriously while I was there. So was sober for a full year, although many hearing the story have suggested I was drunk or high. The first month or so was rocky but invigorating and really kept me going. As I've said, I struggled a bit with the isolation and having to spend my time doing things I never would usually, like tilling the soil and chopping timber wood, but it was good detox, and after a while the smell of the swamp got less shit. At first the sounds of the different birds and nightlife damn near kept me up at night, but in time I learned to distinguish the birds and reptile noises and found comfort in them. On 2 occasions I was lucky enough to hear the booming voice of a croc near the house. It was real back to nature shit, and by the second month I really got into the swing of it, and had adapted fully to having long periods of time alone with myself in the bush. It was sometime this second month that it first happened, though at the time I thought nothing of it. Was sitting on the back veranda on a very warm, crisp afternoon. I was reading, I think, when after some time I became aware of a strange silence. I had to strain my ears for a while, but soon could confirm that there was only the sounds of a slight breeze, the soft movement of water, and the creak of my rocking chair. The usually all-enveloping choir of birds, bugs and frogs had at some point subsided. As I registered this sudden silence, a feeling like no other crawled down me, and I actually physically shuddered. It was like my bones were briefly frosted and I was washed over with an internal coldness and a tingle throughout my skin. I became very dizzy and thought might vomit, so I stood up, and in the second that I put my head it happened, and was over before I could register what I had seen. It's impossible to describe how I must be perceived at the time. All I can say is that I saw a nearby tree, a long thin white spear that stood some distance back from and beneath a couple bigger ones. This tree was like many others. It had shed its branches, leaving just the thin trunk standing up. What I saw was this tree twitching rapidly, like it was having a fucking seizure, before wriggling into place and going still again. No other tree nearby did the same. I doubted my own eyes. Dizziness, forgotten. I stared at it for a long time, not terribly scared but not particularly comfortable either. Side effect of head rush or not. The tree just stood there, still as ever, and I noticed the bird song had come back and warmth returned to my body, and I forgot about it for a long time. I had gotten in with a school teacher in the area and now spent 3 weekdays getting to talk to kids at the education center, so I was spending less daylight hours at the house. On those swamp-lit dusks I would tend to sit on the veranda and have a quiet smoke, maybe read until night came. As summer was turning into whatever season came next, the cycle was not very pronounced in that region, which remains very humid most of the year. I noticed an increase in insects. I don't mind bugs, but I think everything is slightly creeped out by those long-legged flying crane flies, but which in that area were called daddy long legs. I remember sitting at the veranda and seeing for the first time a great swarm of the things, maybe just hatched, forming great clouds against the orangey light of the sky. The crane flies in that swamp got so fucking big. You could hear them rustling against each other, and that is no exaggeration. These things could be meters away and you would hear the vibration sound of their wings. As I say, I'm not too afraid of bugs, but when I went to take a piss in the middle of the night, the toilet was bit of an outhouse, and find myself in a cramped space with a gull-sized crane fly buzzing around the light, occasionally bumping into me and feeling my body with its long horrible legs. I was a tad on edge. The other bug which began to cause me some anxiety was a kind of mollusk, like a barnacle, which would appear in clumps on the water edge after it had been raining. These things weren't particularly creepy, but they worried me because they grow rapidly and would often spread to the steps on the veranda. I asked a local fisherman how to remove them, and he went into his truck and returned with a metal paint scraper. So I added the job of scraping these little barnacle things off the old wooden steps. It was not fun experiencing their reddish interior bodies, the way they peeled off like a hard-shelled scab, and the truly noxious smell. Aside from the growing presence of the insects inside and around the house, I was keeping well. I kept clearing the area of weed plants and chopping down little trees to sell in the town. As well as insects. The seasonal change had brought a tide of litter in the water, which I was told happened every year. More and more clumps of old plastics and bottles and shit was accumulating in a line of detritus outside the house. I started picking it up in the mornings, keeping the water clean while I was there. It was as I did this one morn that for whatever reason I chose to look directly up at that old white tree I'd briefly freaked out over, and I saw it was not there. At first more confused than frightened, I paced the water line, convinced I had mistaken where it was placed. But no, there was no mistake. Everything about the area looked as it always had, clear in my mind from many evenings' study. All but that little tree, where now there was just a bare spot of land. I had no time to think of it, but as I spent the day teaching more and more, I dreaded the return home. I even tried to arrange for a couple of friends I'd made to come over that night, but they insisted on postponing till the weekend. So I drove home alone that night, and when I got back it was full dark. The evening calls of the owls and swamp birds gave me little comfort. I couldn't shake the image of that shivering tree. I had no reason to think anything of it, nor what it might mean, but the image, like a horrible glitch in reality, pestered me no matter how much I tried to distract myself. I'll never forget that night as I lay wide awake in the dark, hearing outside my window this sound, this slow drawn-out creak and cracking noise. I'd heard it before, one sound of the forest out of many, but on this night it pierced my frayed nerves. I lay there a long time listening to it. It sounded like some kind of rickety pole were swaying barely inches from my window. I was too shit-scared cowardly to look out the window, so I examined the patch of moonlight it cast on the floor. I could see so many moving things, the limbs of the trees in the wind, that it was impossible to make out anything. Then, with total clarity, I heard this dreadful noise. Tap. 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 Against the glass. There was no mishearing it, no denying it. As plain as day, there was something tapping the glass just above my head. There was no tree growing near the window, nor even a bush or anything else for that matter. I frantically tried to think up contrived reasons. Maybe the guttering had fallen loose and was tapping the glass in the wind, or it was one of those crane flies hitting the glass. But I couldn't bring myself to look, and lay there, rigid, pretending to be asleep. I waited like this for about 20 minutes before the noise faded. It took me a while to work up the nerve to look out, but of course when I did there was nothing there. After a while it was easier to convince myself that it actually had been something normal, that it was just a minor thing, and got to sleep. The next day was particularly bright. It was that kind of heat which is thick and palpable in the air, which is saying something given the usual weather. In a way my memory of the day, revisited so many times, is saturated in heat, like a photo gets dimmed over time left in the light. When first I got up it was just another day. The events of the previous night and the odd tree were forgotten as I went through the automatic morning rituals. It hadn't got really hot yet and everything was nicely lit. The view of the swamp was gorgeous, the sun behind the canopy seemed to frost every leaf with gold. There was an upswell of bird noise and I saw a couple of wading birds out for frogs or lizards, anticipating the heat of the day. I worked a lot on my study in the morning. After a few too many coffees, came down with that overstimulated restlessness and couldn't focus on work anymore, continuously looking out the window and finding chores to do. The view out the window was especially appealing. The caffeine and the brightness projected everything in rich detail. Seeing some rubbish on the shoreline I convinced myself to dredge it out. So, happily I went down to